CEO kicks veteran out of the office, then sees his service record. Dave Turner stood by the window of his new office, on the top floor of the company's sleek, glass and steel headquarters. As the sun began to set over Seattle, casting long shadows across the city, he felt a mixture of exhilaration and pressure. Being the new CEO of a fast-growing tech firm meant that all eyes were on him. The gleaming skyscraper below was a reflection of everything he had worked for, a symbol of the modern world he championed, where technology and innovation were king. This was his moment, the pinnacle of his career. He'd spent years clawing his way to the top, and now, here he was, with full control over the company's future. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Dave's mind was focused on one thing: results. He'd always been obsessed with efficiency, with optimizing every aspect of the business. In his eyes, productivity was the key to success. Whether it was improving the development process or streamlining internal communication, Dave's approach was simple. Everything had to work like a well-oiled machine. The company had to be lean, efficient, and cutting-edge. Profit margins were paramount, and he was determined to make sure his company was one step ahead of the competition. Nothing and no one was going to get in the way of that. He had risen through the ranks at various tech firms, always pushing for higher performance, more innovation, more market share. He had a reputation for being a tough, no-nonsense leader who didn't tolerate inefficiency. His decisions were quick and decisive, sometimes even ruthless, but always driven by a relentless pursuit of success. He liked to think of himself as a master of the corporate game, someone who understood what it took to make a company thrive in an ever-changing world. And now, as CEO, he could put all of his ideas into practice on the grandest scale. But amidst all the high-level strategy and business talk, the physical office environment seemed like a small, almost trivial detail to Dave. He didn't think much about the behind-the-scenes work that kept everything running smoothly, work that wasn't always seen but was essential nonetheless. Take Frank Wilson, for example. Frank, the janitor, had worked at the company for years, quietly maintaining the building's cleanliness, without fanfare or recognition. Dave had never paid him much attention. To him, Frank was just another employee, part of the background, not the focus of his corporate vision. He had a job to do, and that job was cleaning. Simple as that. Frank had been working at the company for more than 2 decades, a quiet, almost invisible presence who moved from floor to floor, making sure the building stayed spotless. At his age, there were few places he fit in outside of his duties. His life had become the company. He was a man of routine. Early mornings, late nights, working through the ebb and flow of the busy office space. His job consisted mostly of menial tasks that never seemed to end, wiping down surfaces, mopping floors, taking out the trash. Yet, in his mind, there was dignity in the work. Frank had never been one to demand attention, but there was something about the rhythm of his cleaning that felt almost sacred to him, an orderly world in a world that, for the most part, was chaotic and ever-changing. Frank's life, however, was not always like this. Years ago, before he became part of the company's daily fabric, he had been a colonel in the U.S. Army, a leader of men in some of the most dangerous and significant military operations of his time. He had served in conflicts that shaped the world, made critical decisions that determined the lives of many, and earned medals for bravery that few could comprehend. But now, Frank was just a man who mopped the floors and cleaned up after the fast-paced world of the tech company. He had been sidelined by time, by age, by a world that no longer had any use for a retired soldier like him. For Dave, Frank was a ghost in the background, someone whose presence was barely noticeable, much like the building's maintenance or the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. He had never thought much about the older man. He was just part of the infrastructure, like the elevators or the Wi-Fi. But in truth, Dave had no idea who Frank really was. He had no idea that Frank's life had been one of extraordinary sacrifice and leadership. Dave didn't even know that Frank was a decorated war hero, a man who had led men into battle and faced life-and-death situations. To him, Frank was merely another cog in the machine, performing his job with quiet efficiency, and that was enough. It was a typical morning when Dave's impatience with the office distractions first came to a head. He was in the middle of an important meeting with the executive team, discussing new growth initiatives and financial forecasts for the next quarter. Tension was in the air. The numbers weren't as good as they had hoped, and Dave was pushing the team to come up with solutions quickly. His style was direct and to the point, as it always had been. He didn't have time for pleasantries or unnecessary conversation. Results were what mattered, and if the team couldn't deliver, it was on them. But in the midst of this high-stakes conversation, a sound from the hallway began to break through. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but slowly it grew louder, the rhythmic swish of a mop dragging across the floor. Frank was cleaning the corridor just outside the conference room. The sound of it, soft as it was, started to grate on Dave's nerves. The steady motion of Frank's mop seemed to punctuate the room's otherwise tense silence, pulling Dave's attention away from the high-level discussions he was trying to have. It wasn't that Dave was against cleaning, far from it. He just didn't want it happening in the middle of his meeting. "Can't he do this later?" Dave muttered under his breath, annoyed at the disruption. As the noise continued, his irritation grew. This was the kind of distraction that Dave could not tolerate. It seemed, to him, like a lack of respect for the work that was being done inside the room. Every second of time was valuable, and to him, this disruption was an unnecessary waste of time. Without much thought, Dave stood up abruptly and walked to the door of the conference room. Looking out into the hall, Frank was hunched over, focused on his task, oblivious to the corporate world unfolding just a few feet away. Dave stepped into the hallway, his gaze fixed on Frank. He had no patience for what seemed like an intrusion on his time. "Hey, can you do this later?" Dave snapped, his voice sharp. "We're in the middle of a meeting here." His tone was firm, authoritative, a CEO speaking to an employee whose presence he deemed unnecessary at that moment. "I don't need the noise right now. You're disturbing us." Frank looked up, startled by the interruption. For a moment, he stood silently, taking in the confrontation. He knew better than to argue. He had seen this kind of reaction before, employees, managers, and executives who didn't understand why the work of those in the background mattered. He had dealt with people like this for years. But, for a fleeting moment, Frank felt a pang of something he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge: resentment. Here he was, a man who had led soldiers into combat, who had faced death head-on, being treated like an inconvenience. But he didn't let it show. With a small nod, he picked up his mop and moved down the hall, leaving Dave standing in the doorway, his impatience still hanging in the air. To Dave, the encounter was a minor blip in an otherwise productive day. He returned to the meeting, his thoughts quickly refocused on the task at hand. Frank was already forgotten, dismissed as an unnecessary disturbance. After all, what was more important? The company's bottom line, or some old man cleaning floors? But what Dave didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Frank Wilson was far from just a janitor. In fact, he had a story that could change everything. And that story was about to come to light in a way that neither of them could ever have anticipated. As weeks passed in his new role as CEO, Dave Turner's sense of discomfort started to grow. At first, the thrill of being in charge, of having a seat at the table where critical decisions were made, had kept him energized. Every day felt like an opportunity to steer the ship toward a more prosperous future. The power was intoxicating. He was now the one who made the calls, who shaped the company's direction. And yet, despite the constant flow of meetings, the deals, and the corporate maneuvering, there was something gnawing at him. Dave had always prided himself on being a results-oriented leader. He thrived on structure, on pushing for growth, and on the satisfaction that came with achieving ambitious financial targets. Yet, increasingly, he felt like something was missing. The high-octane environment of the tech world, the sharp focus on numbers, the rush to innovate, it all felt like it was becoming a blur. The excitement that had once accompanied every decision now seemed distant, muffled by the weight of routine. The more he found himself at the head of the company, the more he began to question the purpose behind it all. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all the advancements in technology, despite the millions the company was making, there was something hollow about it. His colleagues were just as driven, just as focused on the next quarter's earnings and the next big product launch, but none of them seemed to be asking the deeper questions. What was it all for? What was the ultimate goal of this relentless pursuit of success? These were questions Dave had never asked before. He had always been so focused on the what of business, the strategies, the tactics, the data, that the why had never truly mattered. As a young man, it had been about building his career, climbing the ladder, and proving his worth. He had wanted to prove that he could make it, that he was capable of transforming companies into profitable behemoths. But now, as he settled into his new role, the glamour of it all had started to fade. He began to wonder, was this all there was to his life? There were moments, usually in the quieter stretches of his day, when Dave would find himself looking out of his office window, contemplating. The city sprawled beneath him, full of life and activity, but from his high-rise office, it all felt distant, like a scene in a movie. He had everything he could possibly want: the salary, the power, the respect of his peers. But something was missing. He had a nagging sense of disconnection, a vague yearning for a deeper sense of fulfillment that had eluded him in the high-stakes world of corporate strategy. It wasn't that Dave disliked the people he worked with. On the contrary, he respected his team. They were all driven, smart, and capable. They could talk about scaling systems and market penetration for hours, and he was often impressed by their ideas. But it had started to feel like the conversations had lost meaning. There was little passion in them anymore. Everyone was so fixated on the numbers that the personal stakes, the human element, had become almost irrelevant. Everyone seemed to be chasing the same thing, but Dave wasn't sure anymore what that thing was. Success? Money? Recognition? What did any of it mean if it didn't bring some kind of lasting satisfaction or sense of purpose? He had often heard his colleagues talk about work-life balance and finding meaning in your career. But to him, these words felt hollow. They seemed like distractions, ways to rationalize the fact that people were giving their lives to a system that didn't care about them as individuals. It was a machine, and it didn't slow down for anything or anyone. People came and went, but the grind continued. At the end of the day, all that mattered was the bottom line. That's how Dave had always seen the corporate world, and perhaps it had served him well up until that point. But now, something inside him was starting to question it. In a particularly reflective moment, Dave remembered an old friend from his early career, someone who had always reminded him of the importance of personal connections and purpose. His friend had once told him, "If you're not making a difference in people's lives, you're just filling space." It had seemed like naive idealism back then, something he could dismiss with a smirk. But now, years later, those words started to echo in his mind. At the same time, Dave was becoming more and more aware of the individuals around him, the ones who worked in the shadows of the office, who never made it into the strategic meetings or the glossy boardroom presentations. Frank Wilson, the janitor, had started to appear in his thoughts more frequently. It wasn't just that Frank's presence had been somewhat disruptive that day in the hallway. No, there was something about the man that intrigued Dave. Frank's stoic silence, his unassuming manner, the quiet dedication to his work. It was all so different from the high-energy, high-pressure world that Dave was immersed in. It struck Dave as strange that Frank was a part of the same company, yet he was so completely detached from the corporate culture that Dave himself embodied. There was no ambition in Frank, at least not the kind that Dave understood. Frank wasn't working toward a promotion, wasn't trying to climb a corporate ladder. Instead, he simply did his job, day in and day out, without complaint. Dave found himself wondering, what drove a man like that? What motivated someone to stay in a position like that for so long, doing menial work with no real recognition or reward? Was Frank content with his role? Or was he simply resigned to it? For the first time, Dave found himself wanting to know more about Frank, who he was, what his story was. It was an uncomfortable curiosity, as if he was looking at a part of the world he had long avoided, a part of the world he had never taken the time to understand. Frank wasn't just a janitor. He was a man with a life, a history, and possibly even a perspective that Dave had never considered before. At the same time, Dave's unease about his own life deepened. The more he thought about Frank, the more it seemed that there was a vast gap between the lives they led. Dave's world was one of constant movement, of meetings, presentations, forecasts, and deadlines. It was a world where success was measured in financial terms and where every decision felt like it had to be the right one. There was no room for mistakes, no space for failure. Frank, on the other hand, seemed to have a kind of quiet peace, a steadiness that Dave couldn't quite comprehend. How did he do it? How did he find contentment in such a different world? And yet, as the days wore on, the feeling of wanting something more gnawed at Dave. The relentless grind of corporate life had started to feel less like a challenge and more like a cage. It was as though he was running in place, achieving things that didn't bring him any closer to understanding what he truly wanted. It was an unsettling realization for someone who had spent his entire life building toward success, only to realize that the success he had achieved didn't feel like enough. It wasn't that Dave wanted to walk away from the company or abandon his role as CEO. He knew that the work he was doing mattered, that he was responsible for shaping the future of the organization. But he also couldn't ignore the sense of emptiness that was beginning to take hold. There had to be more to life than just hitting targets, making deals, and ensuring that the company remained profitable. But what was it? What could fill the void that was growing inside of him? In his darker moments, Dave wondered if he would ever find the answer. He was standing at the peak of his career, and yet he felt like he was looking at the world from a distance, as if he were observing someone else's life. He was disconnected, not just from his work, but from the people around him. The employees, the customers, the partners, they were all just pieces on a board, to be moved and repositioned as necessary. But it wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more. He needed more. The question was, how could he find it? It was during one of these moments of self-reflection that Dave saw something he hadn't noticed before. On a bulletin board in the break room, there was a framed set of military medals and a certificate. Frank's name was on it. For the first time, Dave looked closer and saw the years of service, the honors Frank had received, and the stories written in the margins. He was stunned. How could he have missed this? Frank, the janitor, the quiet, unassuming man he had brushed off so many times, was a decorated military officer with a history that dwarfed any of Dave's corporate accomplishments. In that instant, everything shifted. Dave's curiosity about Frank turned into something deeper, a need to understand. And in the process, something inside him began to change as well. It was a Friday afternoon when Dave Turner's life began to shift in a way he never could have predicted. He had spent the better part of the morning reviewing performance reports, answering emails, and meeting with the senior leadership team. It was routine, another day in the life of a CEO. But as the day wore on, Dave found his thoughts drifting back to the bulletin board in the break room, the framed military medals and certificates, the name Frank Wilson printed in bold letters beneath them. It was a curious thing, something so out of place in the corporate setting of the tech company he led. There was no reason for Dave to pay attention to it, yet the more he thought about it, the more the image lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the medals or the rank of colonel that piqued his interest. It was the stark contrast between Frank's position at the company and his extraordinary history. Frank, the janitor, was someone who had risked his life for his country, led men into battle, and received accolades for his service. And yet, here he was, mopping floors, wiping down surfaces, and going unnoticed by most of the office. How could a man with such a remarkable past end up in such a humble, seemingly thankless role? Dave had worked with countless people in his career, all of them driven by their ambitions to climb higher in the corporate world, to make names for themselves, to take risks in the pursuit of personal success. He had never met someone like Frank, a man who seemed content, not with climbing a ladder of ambition, but with simply doing his job, day in and day out. It was perplexing, and it bothered Dave more than he cared to admit. Frank's quiet dignity was the complete opposite of the high-energy, high-stress world Dave inhabited. The more Dave thought about it, the more curious he became. What made Frank tick? What had driven him to serve his country with distinction, only to settle into a janitorial role in his retirement? That afternoon, Dave found himself walking toward the break room. He had been in the office all day, his mind clouded with thoughts of metrics, growth targets, and quarterly reports, but something was pulling him in this new direction. He needed answers, and he needed them now. As he entered the break room, he spotted Frank in the corner, pushing a cleaning cart and preparing to mop the floor. It was an odd feeling, like a sense of déjà vu. Frank didn't look up as Dave approached, his face set in the familiar, silent concentration he always wore while working. "Frank," Dave said, his voice low but not unkind. "Do you have a minute?" Frank paused, giving Dave a pull-it.
A nod.
There was something almost ritualistic about the way Frank looked at him, a mix of surprise and wariness. To Frank, Dave was just another member of the company's elite, another high-powered executive who likely had no real understanding of the life Frank led. But there was something different today. Dave wasn't asking for reports or trying to push for something. He was asking for something else, something intangible that he hadn't even fully articulated to himself. "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" Frank replied, his voice as steady as ever, though there was a slight edge to it. Frank wasn't used to being noticed by the higher-ups, and the fact that Dave had addressed him directly was unusual enough to make him cautious. I noticed the medals," Dave began awkwardly, unsure of how to phrase his thoughts. "The ones in the break room. I didn't know you had a military background." Frank's expression remained unchanged, though his eyes seemed to sharpen at the mention of his past. He had long since accepted the fact that few people in the office cared to know about his history. The medals, the honors, the service, it all felt distant now, buried beneath the dust of time and the monotony of cleaning. But Frank knew the unspoken rules of the corporate world. People at the top didn't ask about the past of those at the bottom. They were interested only in the present, in getting things done, in maintaining the status quo. "Yeah, I served," Frank said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of something deeper, something Dave couldn't quite place. "A long time ago." There was an awkward silence between them. Dave stood there, unsure of how to proceed. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was used to people answering his questions, or at least responding in a way that aligned with his expectations. But Frank wasn't like the people Dave was accustomed to working with. Frank was something else entirely, a man who had lived a life full of experiences Dave couldn't even begin to understand. "I don't know much about that world," Dave admitted, his voice quiet now, almost tentative. "I mean, I've read about it, seen it in movies, but it's different, right? The reality is different from what you see on a screen. I can't imagine what you must have gone through." Frank gave him a long, measured look, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow smaller, more intimate. There was no longer a CEO and a janitor standing in the break room. There was just Dave and Frank, two men with vastly different lives but connected by something deep, though unspoken. "You'd be surprised," Frank said, his voice thick with a world-weary wisdom. "What you see in the movies doesn't even come close to the truth. You think you know what it's like to lead men in combat, to make decisions that can mean life or death, but you don't. It's not just the physical stuff. It's the mental and emotional toll that it takes on you. I'm just doing my best to live with it. I've learned to find peace in the small things." Dave's curiosity only deepened. He hadn't expected this kind of response. Frank wasn't bragging about his achievements. He wasn't glorying in the past or trying to impress anyone. He spoke of his experiences with a quiet humility that made Dave's own life seem trivial in comparison. The CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company, surrounded by wealth and power, was standing in front of a man who had led soldiers in life-or-death situations, and the two couldn't have been further apart in terms of experience or perspective. "Do you ever miss it?" Dave asked before he could stop himself. "I mean, leading people in such a meaningful way. It must have been different from this." Frank's face softened for a moment, as if recalling something long buried. His gaze turned distant, lost in the memories of a past he rarely spoke about. "It was different," Frank said after a long pause. "But I don't miss the violence or the chaos. I miss the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. When you lead people in war, you know that everything you do matters. You know that the choices you make can change the course of history. But when you're cleaning floors, when you're wiping down tables, it's hard to see where the meaning is. You wonder if it even matters. But I do it anyway. I do it because someone has to." Dave stood there, absorbing Frank's words. There was something in them that resonated deeply with him, though he wasn't sure exactly why. It wasn't just the idea of leadership or service. It was the idea of purpose, of doing something that mattered, of making a difference, even in the smallest of actions. Frank had found meaning in his work, even if that meaning wasn't immediately apparent to those around him. Dave realized for the first time that Frank wasn't just cleaning the office. He was holding the space, preserving the environment where others could thrive. It was a realization that left Dave feeling both humbled and unsettled. Here he was, a man who had built his career on high-stakes decisions and corporate growth, and yet he had never considered the power of the small, everyday actions that kept everything running. Frank had been doing something important all along, something that Dave had completely overlooked. "I don't think I fully understand what you mean, Frank," Dave admitted, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "But I want to know more." For the first time since their conversation began, Frank gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement or pride. It was the smile of someone who had long since accepted that the world wasn't going to give him many answers, but he had come to peace with it anyway. "Maybe you will," Frank said softly. "Maybe you will." As Dave turned to leave, something inside him shifted. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. The stirrings of purpose. The world he had built for himself, one of deadlines, numbers, and profits, was starting to seem incomplete. There was something more, something deeper, and Frank Wilson, the janitor, had opened a door that Dave had never known existed. The days following his conversation with Frank Wilson were a blur for Dave Turner. The curiosity that had been sparked during their brief exchange had grown into something much deeper. It wasn't simply the intrigue of Frank's military past that captivated him. It was the way Frank spoke of purpose, of meaning in the smallest tasks, of living a life driven by a sense of duty and dedication. Dave had spent his entire career chasing success, measuring every action by its potential to increase revenue or drive growth. But Frank's words, delivered with quiet authority, began to chip away at the foundation of everything Dave had built his life around. As the days passed, Dave found himself increasingly distracted in meetings, his thoughts drifting to the janitor who had once been a colonel. Frank's calmness, his humility, the way he found meaning in even the most mundane tasks, all of it made Dave question the very purpose of his own existence. The idea that someone like Frank, with such a distinguished past, could be content doing menial work seemed almost absurd. But there was a peace in that absurdity, a comfort in the notion that meaning could be found in places that Dave had never thought to look. Frank had adapted to a life that Dave had never even considered, a life where personal ambition was secondary to service, to community, to doing what needed to be done. The truth was, Dave didn't know how to adapt to this new perspective. He had spent so many years climbing the corporate ladder, convincing himself that achievement and recognition were the only things that mattered, that the idea of finding fulfillment in small, everyday actions seemed foreign. How could he, a man accustomed to high-stakes decisions and cutting-edge technologies, possibly reconcile his world with the quiet, almost anonymous existence that Frank had chosen? How could he learn to value the unspoken contributions that kept everything running smoothly if he himself had never truly paid attention to those contributions? The first step in this adaptation process came when Dave found himself seeking out Frank more often. At first, it was subtle. A brief conversation in the hall, a casual question about how Frank's day was going. Dave had always been a man of efficiency, someone who prided himself on getting straight to the point, but with Frank, he found himself lingering. Frank didn't answer in the rapid-fire, goal-oriented manner Dave was used to. Instead, he took his time, offering simple, yet profound insights into the nature of work, purpose, and service. One afternoon, as Dave was walking through the office after a particularly draining board meeting, he saw Frank again. The janitor was sitting on a bench near the elevator, wiping his hands with a rag. Without thinking, Dave approached him. "Frank, can we talk for a minute?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Frank looked up from his hands, studying Dave for a moment, before giving a small nod. "Sure thing, sir. What's on your mind?" Dave hesitated. He had never been one to discuss personal matters with anyone in the office, let alone someone who had never been part of the corporate inner circle. But now, there was an unfamiliar vulnerability in him. The relentless drive for success, the pressure to perform, it had all started to feel like a mask, one that he didn't know how to remove. With Frank, he felt he could take that mask off, even if just for a moment. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," Dave began, choosing his words carefully. "About how you said you found meaning in the little things, the day-to-day work. It's something I've never really understood." Frank didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded again, as if expecting this. "I've spent my whole career focused on the big wins, the major decisions," Dave continued. "I always thought that's what mattered. That success was measured by the big moments, the growth, the next big thing. But lately, it doesn't feel like enough. I'm starting to wonder if I've been looking in the wrong direction." Frank shifted his position slightly, his eyes never leaving Dave. "You know, sir, when you spend enough time in this line of work, any kind of work, you start to realize that most of it is just smoke and mirrors. We chase after success. But for what? So we can feel like we're in control? So we can measure ourselves against some abstract ideal?" Dave nodded, his heart racing. Frank's words were starting to hit home. They were simple, but they carried a weight that Dave couldn't ignore. He had spent years chasing this elusive concept of success, never once stopping to consider whether it was truly fulfilling him. And now, as he stood here, talking to a man who had lived a life far different from his own, he was beginning to see that perhaps the very thing he had been striving for wasn't what he needed after all. Frank leaned back slightly, adjusting his posture. "You see, what most people don't understand is that meaning isn't something you find by looking outward. It's something that comes from within. It's in the choices you make, the work you do, and how you choose to do it. Most people think it's about what they accomplish, but it's not. It's about how they show up." Dave felt a knot form in his stomach. The weight of Frank's words seemed to settle in the air between them, thickening with meaning. The idea of showing up, not for the accolades, not for the recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do, was a concept Dave had never fully considered. He had always believed that success came from achieving external goals, from measuring growth and profitability. He had never stopped to think about the intrinsic value of showing up, of doing the work, of serving something greater than himself. Frank's calm demeanor seemed to deepen in that moment. "I've cleaned these floors for years," he continued, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet power. "And I've never once thought about the praise or the money. I just do it because it needs to be done. And in doing that, I've found my peace. I don't need anything more than that." Dave's mind was reeling. He had always believed that peace was a byproduct of success, of achieving something monumental. But Frank was telling him something different. That peace could be found in the simplest of tasks, in the act of showing up and doing the work, regardless of its scale. "I've been so caught up in the idea that I have to achieve, that I have to win," Dave admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "But I've never asked myself why I want any of it, why I need any of it." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Dave's face. "That's the hardest question to answer, isn't it? Most people spend their entire lives chasing after the wrong things because they've never taken the time to ask why. They think it's about the money, the fame, the power. But it's really about finding something worth fighting for. Something bigger than yourself." Dave sat down beside Frank, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a man grappling with the larger questions of existence, with what it meant to live a life of purpose and fulfillment. He wasn't sure what the answers were, but he knew that the search for those answers had only just begun. "I've spent my life chasing the wrong things," Dave said softly. "I've been focused on the wrong kind of success. But I don't know how to change that." Frank looked at him then, his gaze filled with understanding. "It's not about changing who you are, Dave. It's about changing how you look at the world. Success doesn't have to be about what you accumulate. It's about how you contribute. You don't need to be a hero to make a difference. You just have to show up every day and do the work with heart. That's what matters." For the first time in a long while, Dave felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from achieving a goal or securing a deal. It was a quiet, unshakable peace that came from understanding, from realizing that the path to fulfillment wasn't always about winning. Sometimes it was about simply being present and doing the right thing, no matter how small the task seemed. As Dave left the break room that day, he didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path, one that didn't require more accolades or recognition, but a deeper, more meaningful engagement with the world around him. He had taken the first steps into an unfamiliar situation, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew he was no longer walking it alone. In the weeks following his conversation with Frank, Dave Turner found himself increasingly unsettled by the dissonance between the life he had built and the quiet, profound wisdom that Frank had shared with him. Dave had always prided himself on being a man of action, decisive, confident, and driven by results. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, each step carefully calculated, each move designed to take him closer to the next level of success. Yet now, as he tried to reconcile Frank's perspective with his own, he felt as though he were standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of which direction to take next. It wasn't that Dave rejected the principles Frank had imparted to him, the idea that fulfillment came not from achievement, but from finding meaning in the everyday acts of work. No, it was that he struggled to apply those principles to his own life. Frank seemed to understand, in the quiet moments of his life, that it wasn't the accolades or the wealth that mattered. It was the act of showing up, of doing the right thing, even in small, unnoticed ways. But Dave wasn't sure how to make that shift. He was a CEO, after all, not a janitor. He was the one making decisions, not cleaning floors. His life was built around progress, growth, and visibility, not humility and quiet service. How could he find the balance between the two worlds, the world of high stakes, high pressure, and the world of service, purpose, and quiet fulfillment? Determined to apply the lessons he had learned, Dave decided to put them into practice. He began to look for ways to make his leadership style less about performance metrics and more about serving his employees. He wanted to demonstrate that he understood the importance of purpose and that he wasn't just a CEO for the sake of the company's bottom line. He was a leader who wanted to bring out the best in his people, to foster a sense of community and mutual respect, and to lead by example. If Frank could find meaning in his work as a janitor, then surely Dave could find a way to instill that same sense of purpose in the very employees who worked for him. The first major decision he made was to revamp the company's annual conference. Traditionally, the event had been a high-octane affair, a stage for showcasing the company's growth, a place where executives and top-tier performers were celebrated, their accomplishments paraded before the rest of the employees. But now, Dave saw it through a different lens. He didn't want this event to be about shining the spotlight on only a few people. He wanted it to reflect the contributions of everyone, no matter their role. He had Frank come to mind almost immediately. He wanted Frank to be a part of the event, not as a janitor, but as a speaker. Frank's words had already begun to shape Dave's thinking, and he believed that the employees would benefit from hearing what Frank had to say. Frank's life had been shaped by a sense of duty and service, and Dave was convinced that the lessons Frank had learned in the military and carried with him into his civilian life could inspire others in the company. It was a bold move, one that Dave knew would likely be met with skepticism. After all, Frank wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to see on stage at a corporate event. But that was precisely why Dave wanted him there. It wasn't about the image Frank projected. It was about the wisdom he had accumulated over the course of his life. When Dave approached Frank with the idea of speaking at the event, Frank was taken aback. At first, he hesitated, unsure of why the CEO would want him to participate in such a high-profile event. He had spent years working in the background, quietly performing his duties without much recognition. The thought of standing before a crowd of employees, many of whom were young and ambitious, made Frank feel uncomfortable. He was used to working in the shadows, out of sight and out of mind. But Dave persisted, insisting that Frank's voice, his story, was one that needed to be heard. "Frank, your story is important," Dave said. "What you've been through, what you've learned, it could inspire people here. It's not about being a hero or a celebrity. It's about sharing what really matters, the things we all overlook. You have wisdom that's invaluable, and I want to give you the platform to share it." After some time, Frank reluctantly agreed, although he wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea. The day of the conference arrived, and Frank found himself backstage, preparing for his speech. He had never spoken in front of an audience this large before, and the anxiety was palpable. The lights were bright, the stage overwhelming, and the crowd out there unfamiliar, expectant, perhaps even skeptical of his presence. Frank was a man of few words, and the thought of addressing a room full of strangers made him feel vulnerable. But Dave's words had stuck with him, and for some reason, he wanted to give it a try. Maybe, just maybe, there was something he could offer the room. As the event kicked off, the atmosphere was electric. Dave took the stage first, delivering his usual polished presentation on the company's growth and future plans. But as the day wore on, it became evident that something was missing. The employees were listening, yes, but their eyes often wandered. Their focus waned. The speech about profits, goals, and strategies, though important, seemed hollow in comparison to the stories that were yet to be told. Dave could see it in their faces. They were waiting for something more. They wanted a connection. Finally, the moment arrived for Frank to speak. Dave introduced him with a few words, briefly outlining his service in the military and his transition to life after the army. Frank walked up to the podium slowly, the microphone feeling foreign in his hands. He took a deep breath, scanning the crowd of employees who looked at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. But Frank wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply wanted to share his experience. He started slowly, speaking about his time in the army, about the bonds formed in combat, about the sacrifices, the lives lost, the lessons learned in the trenches. His voice was steady, unadorned, and as he spoke, a sense of calm began to fill the room. Frank talked about the small, unheralded tasks that made a difference, the moments when a soldier chose to show up for his comrades, to be there for someone who needed it, even if no one was watching. He spoke of the quiet victories that didn't make the headlines, but were felt in the hearts of those who had shared in them. "I've done a lot of things in my life," Frank said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I've led men into battle, made decisions that could mean life or death, and I've seen things that would break most people. But what matters most to me now is the same thing that always mattered: showing up, doing what needs to be done, and being there for the people around you. The world doesn't always reward those who do the small things, but those small things make all the difference." As Frank continued speaking, Dave watched from the side of the stage, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what he had wanted, to give people like Frank a platform to share their stories. To show his employees that there was more to life than just business metrics, than just the next big deal. Frank's words resonated in the room, and as the speech came to an end, the applause was loud and genuine. There was no grandeur, no corporate accolades, just an honest appreciation for the wisdom that Frank had shared. However, as the applause died down and the conference moved into the next phase, Dave began to feel an unexpected emptiness. It was a strange feeling. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. He had given Frank the recognition he deserved, and in doing so, he had lived up to his own ideal of leading with purpose and humility. But something was missing. Frank's speech had inspired the team, yes, but it hadn't answered the deeper questions that were stirring in Dave's own heart. As the event came to a close, Dave found himself standing alone in a corner of the conference room, lost in thought. He had done what he thought would bring him peace. He had aligned his actions with his values. He had created a meaningful experience for his employees, and yet, he didn't feel fulfilled. In fact, he felt more disconnected than ever. He had gotten what he thought he wanted: validation for his new approach, recognition for giving Frank a platform, but in doing so, he realized that what he really needed wasn't applause or acknowledgement from others. What he needed was something deeper, something more personal. A sense of inner peace that didn't come from external recognition, but from within. The applause had faded, the lights had dimmed, and Dave was left with the realization that he was still searching. What he had thought would bring him fulfillment, the act of aligning with Frank's ideals, had merely scratched the surface. True peace, he now understood, was not something that could be achieved through external actions alone. It was something that had to be cultivated from within. The weeks following the company conference should have been a time of reflection for Dave Turner, a time to bask in the success of the event and to continue building on the lessons he had learned from Frank. But instead of finding peace, he found himself sinking deeper into a state of dissatisfaction. The applause from the employees, the genuine appreciation for Frank's speech, none of it had filled the void inside him. The validation he thought he would feel from his actions felt fleeting and insubstantial, like trying to hold onto water in cupped hands. It slipped through his fingers, and he was left with the same feeling of emptiness he had been battling for months. Dave had been trying to align his leadership with the principles Frank had imparted to him, but in doing so, he had inadvertently pushed aside the very core of his own identity. He had spent so many years building his career on a foundation of ambition, power, and external success that he didn't know who he was anymore without those things. He had made concessions in his leadership, trying to prioritize humility and service, but in doing so, he felt like he was abandoning the very qualities that had gotten him to the top. The qualities that had made him the confident, decisive leader people had respected. The qualities that had helped him achieve success. It wasn't just a professional crisis, it was personal, too. At home, things were starting to unravel. Dave's marriage to his wife, Clara, had always been stable, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared goals. But recently, they had grown apart. Clara had always been supportive of Dave's ambitions, but she had begun to voice concerns about the toll his career was taking on their relationship. She'd noticed the long hours, the missed dinners, the emotional distance that seemed to grow wider with each passing week. At first, Dave had dismissed her concerns, believing that the success he was striving for would ultimately benefit them both. But now, as he reevaluated everything, he began to see the cracks in their relationship. He wasn't present for her in the way he used to be. He wasn't emotionally available. One night, after a long day at the office, Dave came home late to find Clara sitting on the couch, waiting for him. The apartment was quiet, the lights dim, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background the only sound. Clara looked up when Dave entered, her face drawn with fatigue. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Dave immediately felt the weight of her words. He had known this conversation was coming. He had felt it in the air for weeks. But he had been avoiding it, burying himself in work, in the endless pursuit of goals that seemed to grow larger and more elusive with every passing day. He wasn't ready for a confrontation, not now, not when he was already struggling to find answers to questions that had been plaguing him for so long. "Clara, can we?" Dave began, but she cut him off. "No, Dave," she said quietly. "We can't keep pretending like everything is fine. You're not here anymore. You haven't been here for a long time. And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that I don't notice." The words hit Dave like a punch to the gut. He had known, deep down, that his obsession with work was taking a toll on his marriage, but hearing Clara say it out loud made it all too real. It felt like he was being pulled in two different directions, his personal life unraveling while his professional life seemed to demand more of him than ever before. The tension between the two was unbearable, and Dave didn't know how to fix either one. "I'm here," Dave protested weakly, but Clara shook her head. "No, Dave. You're physically here, but you're not really here. I don't know who you are anymore. And I don't know how much more of this I can take." Dave sat down heavily on the arm of the couch, feeling the weight of her words sink in. The guilt, the shame, the realization that he had allowed his ambition to consume him, it all hit him at once. He had been so focused on doing the right thing at work, on living up to Frank's ideals of service and purpose, that he had neglected the very relationships that had once grounded him. He had been so intent on finding fulfillment through work that he had ignored the emotional needs of his wife, his partner, the person who had always stood by him. Clara's eyes were wet with unshed tears, and she didn't look at him as she spoke next. "I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that I'm not alone in this marriage, that I'm not second place to your job, to your pursuit of success." Dave opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He had no defense. There was no justification for the way he had been treating her, no excuse for how emotionally distant he had become. He had been chasing the wrong thing for so long that he hadn't realized what he was losing in the process. And now, the person who mattered most was slipping away from him. Clara stood up, her face a mask of sorrow and frustration. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Dave. I don't know if you're the man I married anymore." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Dave alone with the haunting realization that he was losing her. The weight of his professional life, the accolades, the meetings, the deals, seemed meaningless now, hollow in comparison to the depth of what he was losing on the personal front. That night, as Dave lay in bed, he felt a profound sense of isolation. He had spent so many years striving for success, but in the process, he had alienated the people who mattered most. He had thought that achieving success in his career would bring him fulfillment, that it would give him purpose and validation. But now, as he faced the breakdown of his marriage, he realized how misguided he had been. The external achievements that he had pursued so relentlessly were empty, without the relationships that had once grounded him. He couldn't continue to live this way. The next day at work, Dave found himself disconnected, unable to focus on the tasks that once consumed him. The meetings, the emails, the presentations, none of it mattered. He sat in his office, staring at his computer screen, but he wasn't seeing the numbers or the graphs. His mind kept drifting back to Clara, to the conversation they had had the night before. He had been so fixated on his need to prove himself, to be the best, that he had lost sight of the things that truly mattered. His relationship with his wife, the people in his life who loved him, the peace that comes from balance. None of it had been part of the equation. It was then that he realized how deeply his need for external validation had affected him. His entire sense of self-worth had been tied to the acknowledgement he received from his job, from the company, from the people around him. And now, the very thing he had worked so hard to achieve, his professional success, had come at the cost of everything else. He had gained the respect of his employees, the recognition of his peers, but he had lost the people who truly mattered. His personal life was unraveling, and in trying to apply Frank's teachings of humility and service, he had lost sight of his own identity. In seeking to become a more compassionate, selfless leader, he had compromised too much of himself. The work that had once brought him purpose had now become the source of his greatest regret. It was clear to him now that he had been paying a heavy price for everything he had gained. He had sacrificed his own sense of self, his family, and his happiness for the sake of success. But as the realization set in, so did the despair. What could he do now? How could he begin to repair the damage? He had gained what he thought he wanted, recognition, purpose, and a new approach to leadership, but he had lost everything that truly mattered in the process. His pursuit of external validation had been his undoing, and he wasn't sure how to recover from it. The days following the confrontation with Clara were the darkest that Dave Turner had ever experienced. The weight of his own choices, his relentless strive for success, his neglect of the people who loved him, and his unrelenting pursuit of external validation seemed to crush him from every direction. It was as if everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had been for nothing. The recognition he had gained at work, the respect he had commanded as a CEO, felt hollow now. In trying to reshape his leadership according to the principles Frank had imparted, he had lost sight of what truly mattered, the relationships that grounded him, and the deep inner peace that he now understood was far more important than any accolade or promotion. In the days following the conversation with Clara, Dave felt adrift. He found himself revisiting his past decisions, sifting through the choices he had made in his career and his personal life, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. The disconnection from his wife, the emotional distance from his colleagues, and the gnawing sense of emptiness he felt in his own soul were undeniable signs that his life had gotten off course. For the first time in a long time, Dave took a step back from the corporate machine that had consumed him for so many years. He needed time to think, to reflect, and perhaps most importantly, to reconnect with himself. During this period of solitude, Dave found himself drawn to the teachings that Frank had shared with him at the company conference. Frank had spoken about the power of small, meaningful actions, of showing up for the people around you and doing the work that needs to be done, even if no one notices. At the time, Dave had been focused on how to apply these teachings in a corporate setting, but now he realized that the lessons Frank had shared were not just about leadership or company culture. They were about life itself. Frank had found peace in doing what needed to be done, without the expectation of praise or recognition. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about living with integrity, showing up every day, and finding purpose in the work, no matter how small or unnoticed it might seem. As Dave sat in his office one afternoon, reflecting on Frank's words, it occurred to him that he had been chasing the wrong kind of fulfillment all along. For years, he had been seeking external validation, believing that success and recognition from others would bring him peace. But as the reality of his situation began to settle in, his marriage on the rocks, his emotional disconnection from his team, and his deep inner turmoil, it became clear to him that true fulfillment could not be found outside of himself. It had to come from within. This realization was both freeing and sobering. Dave understood now that the success he had achieved, while impressive in the eyes of others, had not been worth the cost of his emotional health or his relationships. The very things he had taken for granted, his wife, his family, his ability to be present and engaged in life, were the things that held the most value. As Dave began to grapple with this new understanding, he realized that he needed to make changes, not just in his professional life, but in his personal life as well. The first step, he knew, was to address the brokenness in his marriage. Clara's words still echoed in his mind. "I don't know who you are anymore." It was a painful truth, but Dave understood it now. He had become a stranger to her, a man consumed by the external trappings of success, but emotionally absent when it mattered most. He had been so focused on proving himself in the world of business that he had neglected the most important relationship in his life. One evening, Dave decided to sit down with Clara and have a heart-to-heart conversation. It was not an easy conversation, but he knew it was necessary. He had to be vulnerable, honest about his shortcomings, and take responsibility for the way he had been living. He also had to listen, to truly listen to Clara's feelings, her pain, and her frustrations. The process of reconnecting would not be quick or easy, but it had to start somewhere. Dave needed to show Clara that he was committed to change, not just for the sake of their marriage, but for the sake of his own well-being and peace of mind. That evening, as Clara sat across from him in their living room, Dave spoke from the heart. "Clara, I've been a fool," he began, his voice raw with emotion. "I've been chasing the wrong things for so long. I've neglected you, our relationship, and myself. I've been so caught up in this idea of success, of what I'm supposed to be, that I lost sight of what really matters. I can't undo the past, but I can promise you that I'm going to do everything I can to be the man I was before all of this." To seek validation from external sources. True validation came from within. As his relationship with Clara improved, so did his sense of fulfillment. He no longer felt the need to be a superhero, to live up to unrealistic expectations. He was content with the person he had become, the man who could show up, who could be present, who could care deeply and authentically. At work, Dave shifted his focus as well. He stopped measuring success solely by the company's bottom line or his personal achievements. Instead, he focused on creating a workplace culture that nurtured collaboration, transparency, and mutual respect. He no longer needed to be the center of attention, the one who commanded respect. Instead, he became a leader who empowered others, who valued their contributions, and who recognized the importance of service above self. And in doing so, he became a more effective leader than he had ever been before, not because he was chasing recognition, but because he was living with integrity. In the end, Dave realized that the journey he had been on, his pursuit of success, his attempt to apply Frank's lessons, his personal crisis, had all led him to a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. He had gone through pain, loss, and introspection, but in the process, he had found peace. He had learned that success wasn't about what others saw or what they valued. It was about living authentically, showing up for the people.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.